Most listening lessons don't actually teach listening. You play the audio, students answer questions, and then you check the answers. But students still don't understand English. I've been teaching and training English teachers in Japan for nearly 10 years, and I've seen this same pattern happen over and over, including in my own early lessons. In this video, I'll show a simple, step-by-step listening lesson structure that actually trains listening, what to do before, during, and after listening. So your students finally learn how to listen, not just whether they understood or not. This channel is about understanding how language learning actually works, and then teaching in a way that responds to that reality. So here's the core problem. Most listening lessons are designed like quizzes. You play the audio, answer questions, check the answers, and then move on. This tells you who understood, but it doesn't teach your students how to understand better next time. I remember early in my teaching career finishing a listening activity and realizing that a large part of the class had completely missed it. And then I think, okay, now what? We just kind of move on. The lesson didn't show me where listening broke down. Was it the vocabulary, the grammar, speed, pronunciation? Like, why couldn't students understand? I had no way of knowing, and I just moved on to the next activity. And very often, the issue isn't that students didn't understand the vocabulary or grammar. It's that the spoken English doesn't sound the way they expect it to. Things like linking, reduction, sound changes get in the way. And unless we design lessons to surface those problems, students just keep on guessing. So let me show you the lesson structure I use to fix that. The structure itself is pretty simple. There's before listening, during, and after. And what matters is how you intentionally use each step. So to make this concrete, I'll use a short example, a student's speech about their favorite book. Step 1 is pre-listening. Pre-listening has 2 jobs. The first job is to activate students' schema. Before students listen, they need some kind of mental framework. Instead of pressing play right away, I ask something like, okay, if someone gives a speech about their favorite book, what kind of information do you think they'll talk about? I usually do a quick think, pair, share, and then I'll get students to answer things like the title, the author, the year it was written, the characters. And if they answer in Japanese, that's fine. I'll just rephrase it in English and write the keywords on the board. This step matters because in real life, we almost always know what we're listening to and why. But in class, students get none of that. And without context, listening feels like being dropped in a white room and suddenly hearing a voice say, "Today, I'd like to talk about my favorite book." Of course, that's hard to understand. You'd be like, what is happening, right? The second job is to give students a listening objective. The second job of pre-listening is not just telling students what to listen for, it's controlling what they pay attention to while they're listening. Listening is a real-time process. Students can't hold everything in their heads at once. When we simply say, listen and answer the questions, we force them to listen to everything. Because of that, they end up listening to nothing. Instead, we need to narrow the focus. Before playing the audio, tell students what they should listen to. For this speech about the favorite book, I'd say something like, okay, first, listen to the title of the book and the reasons why the speaker likes it. Listen to the title of the book and why the speaker likes it. That single sentence does something important. It gives students a goal for listening. They're not trying to catch every word now. They're basically trying to listen for what you tell them to listen to. And this is basically how listening works in real life as well. We don't listen for everything. We listen for the answer to our specific question. Okay, so if you did step 1 well, then step 2 is pretty manageable. But there's one rule that matters more than anything else. Have students listen twice with different goals each time. Listening is not about understanding everything. It's about identifying what matters and being able to retrieve that information afterwards. Even native speakers don't listen word for word or remember everything they hear. We listen with priorities, and we focus on the information that's important to us. So when students say, they didn't understand everything, that doesn't mean they failed. If they can identify the key information, then they were able to listen. That's why we separate listening into two parts. The first time students listen, you should get them to listen to the big picture. For example, what's the book title? Why does the speaker like it? These are big picture concepts. And at this stage, accuracy isn't the goal. Now, then in the second listening, you get students to listen for specific information. Things like who wrote it? When was it written? Who are the characters? Where's the setting? At this point, because they already have the context, it's much easier for them to get the specific information. If you start with details, listening quickly becomes overwhelming. Your students will try to hold in the names, dates, places all at once without a clear idea. But when you go big picture first and detail second, it's much easier for your students to understand. Okay, now step 3, this is the step that most teachers skip. Most teachers just check answers and then move on. But this is the step that will actually build students' listening ability. Up to this point, the listening is only happening in the students' heads. We can't see it, and your students can't see it either. But this step changes that. So after checking answers, do not move on yet. Show your students the script. Ask them to read it quietly and underline the parts that they couldn't catch while they're listening. If they do this, then the listening becomes visible on the page. And then get your students to ask themselves this one question. Is this a language problem or a listening problem? So a language problem means that they don't understand the vocabulary or they don't understand the grammar. A listening problem means they know the words, they understand it when they read it, but they couldn't catch it when they were listening. This distinction matters because it tells students what they need to work on. And some teachers might think, oh, wouldn't this discourage my students? Some of my students might highlight everything. And then they'll think, oh, I wasn't able to understand anything at all. I failed. So you need to set expectations early. Tell your students, our goal is not to understand everything. It's to understand more than before. So at the beginning, even if your students underline everything, that's fine. What matters is now they can see what they couldn't hear. They can at least identify why they weren't able to understand something. And that alone is really good information. So this was actually a turning point for me as a language learner as well. When I was studying Korean, there were parts of conversations that I couldn't catch. But then when I looked at the script, I realized I could understand everything. I knew the vocabulary and I understood the grammar. But the real problem was that the sounds changed in natural speech and I didn't know about those sound changes. And once I saw clearly what those sound changes were, I knew what I had to work on. I knew I had a listening problem, not a language problem. Okay, now back to the class. When several students underline the same sentence, that's incredibly useful information. It shows you exactly where listening broke down. And even if it is a language problem, oh, my students couldn't understand that word or that grammar point, you know, okay, so this is what I need to teach. And if you know that they understood those vocabulary and grammar, then you can identify what part of that sentence were they not able to catch, what sort of sound change, and you can give them more instruction on that. Okay, so before we finish, let me point out a few common mistakes teachers often make. Mistake number 1, treating listening like an answer checking activity. So if you just check the answers and move on, you haven't taught listening. You've just given a listening test. Answer checking tells you who understood, but it doesn't tell you why others didn't. And without that information, your students' listening will not improve. So make sure you don't just test listening, but train it afterwards. Okay, mistake number 2 is just replaying the audio and thinking that is listening training. So this is something that I used to do as well. After I check the answers, I'll show students the script, play it again, and get students to listen to it and think, okay, all right, we did listening practice. And that may work for some students, but it doesn't really help train listening skill. If you want students to improve in listening, after any listening activity, you need to spend some time on pronunciation practice. For example, you choose one sentence that many students struggled with, and you can know that by walking around and seeing which sentences most of your students highlight. Pick out that sentence and then show what is happening with the sounds. Have students say it out loud. Okay, so here's an example. Say your students hear this. Today, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite books, Winnie the Pooh. I've read it at least 10 times since I was a child. And they were able to hear Winnie the Pooh and maybe 10 times and then child. But the other parts, like one of my favorite books, maybe they heard favorite, but they weren't able to hear one of my, or I read it. Maybe they thought they would hear I have read it, but they heard I read it at least 10 times. And they didn't hear the at least part. They heard at least like that. Or since I was a child, they just heard since I was. So they're like, what is that, right? So they were able to catch the key information, but like connector words, function words, they weren't able to hear that, and that threw them off. And that's okay too. In step 3, you can address this with them by having them highlight those parts and telling them, oh, maybe, like you heard Winnie the Pooh, but you weren't able to hear one of my, or I read it. So they highlight those parts, and then you teach the sound changes. I'll talk about sound changes in another video. You teach those sound changes and then have them read it again as it is spoken, not how it would be read. Does that make sense? So for Japanese students, they would usually say something like, today I'd like to talk about one of my favorite, right? So they pronounce every sound clearly, but in English, that's not how that works, right? So you have to teach them, this is how spoken English is actually pronounced. And you practice it with them so that they get that muscle memory and they understand it's not one of my favorito, but one of my favorite, like that, one of my, like that. Okay, so just, doing those sorts of pronunciation practice after you do listening, your students are going to start to understand, oh, I can't say every syllable as its own sound. I have to link the words together. And even if they don't do that by themselves, they just know that this is how English works. So again, sound changes is really important. That's why I'll have another video about it that you can watch. So if you take one thing from this video, it's that listening improves when we stop testing comprehension and start training attention. You don't need new materials to do this. Just try this listening structure once a week, even with a short, simple audio. And then after listening, get your students to highlight what they weren't able to catch and then ask themselves, is this a language problem or a listening problem? And just by knowing that, they'll be able to diagnose why they weren't able to listen. And if your students know the words, but they still missed it, that means it's a listening problem. And that is your cue to teach sound changes. So if you'd like a full breakdown of the sound changes that hinder students listening, leave a comment below and let me know. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.